Hello there, welcome back to Language Professora. In this video, we are going to be looking at imagery, still in our literary devices series. What is imagery? Now, as the term suggests, imagery has something to do with an image, right? Now, as it pertains to imagery from a literary standpoint, it's one of our devices that is often used in our genres. Our genres are poetry, novels, and plays. I usually call them the three P's: poetry, prose, plays. And it's writing that uses vivid descriptions to bring what is being written to life. So I'll say off the bat that you're not going to necessarily find imagery coming across very strongly in just a single sentence. It's more along the lines of perhaps a paragraph or even a scene that is being described. And the imagery that is being used is what comes to the fore. So, imagery in terms of the language used, it usually paints a picture and it pulls on a couple of things, right? It's a device that makes an appeal to the senses because it's through our senses that we get information. And so imagery aims at our senses. Our main ones, well, main ones, we know we have five senses, but there are schools of thought that say we have more than five. But the five ones that we know of, we have seeing, hearing, tasting, smelling, and feeling. As we go through this video, we're going to come upon a few others, maybe just about two outside of this, but let's get into it. So another thing I want to mention though is that imagery uses up some of the other literary devices that you're very familiar with. So devices like similes, metaphors, onomatopoeia, the imagery uses up those devices to make the image come to life. Imagery is used when you want to establish setting. So if you are doing short stories, the writers in those stories would have been describing certain things to establish the settings in the stories. Imagery can also be used if we want the reader to fall in love with a character or to hate a character or to have a connection to a character based on how the character is described and images used to bring that character to life. The reader is a little bit more connected to the character. And it's also used if you want to immerse your characters in particular situations. So I'm going to go off the bat again and say exposure to literary works will expose you to imagery. We have some types of imagery we're going to be looking through. There are 7 main types, and most, if not all of them, depend on the senses in one way or the other. Let's get into them. First off the bat, we have our visual imagery. This one is kind of clear cut. It's what you are able to see. And so, what the writer will do is describe something, whatever it is that they're trying to bring across to you, in a way that you can do what? Visualize it. You're able to see what they are saying because of the word picture they're painting with the images that they're using. And so think about if you're talking to a friend, if you're talking to a family member and they're describing something to you, and it's almost as though you can picture it in your head. It's a visual imagery technique that is being used. And some of the visual qualities that we can think about are things like what things look like in terms of the shape, in terms of the colors, in terms of the patterns, in terms of being light or being dark. And I'm very careful to use words that stick to what can be seen, and we're not delving into the other senses just yet. So we get visual imagery being achieved, as I said before, when we use some of those other literary devices like our similes and our metaphors. We have an example, a quick example, to say somebody looks like Helen of Troy. Helen of Troy is one of those characters from the mythology series, whether it be Greek or Roman mythology, I forget which. And if you're said to look like Helen of Troy, a comparison is being made between the individual and Helen of Troy. And if you know the characteristics of Helen of Troy, you'll know what the individual is like. But an image was created based on what was being said. Auditory imagery is our second one. And auditory, as it has to do with audio, so the hearing. So this imagery is coming across based on what you can hear. Now, this is a little bit tricky when you're reading words and you have to imagine what you might be hearing, right? So, what you can use for some of this imagery is, for example, if you're describing a scene, and rather than describing what can be seen, you're also getting a description of what could be heard. So, in the sense of maybe describing war, they're describing what the gunfire sounds like, what the explosions sound like, screams and helicopters. If you're describing a concert, you may be describing the high volume of the music. You may be describing the sound of the crowds. Notice I said the sound of the crowds. So it's all coming back to what you can hear. Now, onomatopoeia, which is another of our literary devices, is one of the devices that is best used with auditory imagery because onomatopoeia has to do with sound. The next one that we're looking at is gustatory. That one is a little bit tricky, but gustatory has to do with taste. So if you're engaged in a particular piece of work and something is being described in terms of what something might taste like, so a character is eating and they're describing the food as bland and flavorless and there's no seasoning and whatever. It's almost as if you're actually making up your face because you can just imagine how much it doesn't taste good. Versus if something is being, and this is why I should say, this is why sometimes when persons are writing or you're reading certain pieces that have gustatory imagery included, you feel hungry. It's almost as though you can taste the food because of what is being described. So it can be described as sweet, spicy, savory, salty. You get what I'm saying? And your taste buds begin to respond because of the gustatory imagery that is coming across. And the same can go in the opposite in terms of it can be something that doesn't really taste good and you feel that sense of ick. You know, it's just a turn off. But the gustatory imagery is coming to the fore. Another one is the olfactory, and the olfactory has to do with the smell. So again, the picture that is being painted is all surrounding smells. So maybe it's after a shower of rain and you're being told how the ground smells in terms of that earthy, muddy scent. You may be talking about the fresh scent in the air. If you have just gone through the garden and maybe watered, it happens to me when I'm watering and the water touches my herbs, the scent of the herbs rises up. So you're talking about the smell of the lavender, the smell of the peppermint, the smell of the rosemary, the smell of the basil. And all of these things having to do with smell all come back to olfactory imagery. Another one is our tactile imagery. Now, tactile has to do with touch. So, this is where the writer will be using words that have to do with texture. It might have to do also with how things might feel around you. So, if you're describing an Amazon rainforest and you're talking about the sweltering heat, the sweat dripping down my face, which is also a visual combined with the tactile. But it's almost as though you can feel the heat, you can feel the sweat dripping down. And that has to do with the tactile imagery. Another thing that could be said to be tactile is if you're sorry, if you're maybe in the kitchen and you're kneading the dough and you're describing how the dough that you are having in front of you feels like a cloud, it feels like a pillow, and the reader gets the image in terms of what that pile of dough feels like. Another one is our kinesthetic imagery. And kinesthetic has to do with motion. So, again, in a literary piece, if they're describing how fast or how slow something might be moving, that is a kinesthetic imagery. And once you get an image of moving through the space with the characters, and again, you're going to find that the imageries don't work on their own, because the kinesthetic here could also be mixed in with the auditory. It could be mixed in with the visual. It could be mixed in with your onomatopoeia. You get what I'm saying? So they all kind of work hand in hand depending on what needs to be said. And finally, we have what is called the organic imagery. And this is the one that it's not very clearly any of the others, but there's a feeling. Not the tactile feeling, but more like an emotional response. This is why you may read stories and you start to cry, or you start to laugh, or you become angry. So there is an emotional response to what you are reading or what you're being introduced to. And in a nutshell, those are your imageries. So just think about the senses, what you can see, what you can hear, what you can taste, what you can smell, what you can feel, and then additionally, movement or motion and your emotional response to whatever it is that you are reading. So go and explore imagery. Happy reading!